All right, first I want to apologize that Wednesday night I didn't have my thing mirrored on the screen. I assumed that it was up there, and I didn't even bother looking back, so I don't know if I just forgot to do it or if I thought I did it and maybe it didn't connect, I don't know. But I apologize, so hopefully next Wednesday night we'll have everything set up the way it's supposed to. It is on now, yeah, all right. All right, we are continuing in Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Huh? Don't look back. Ecclesiastes chapter 9. We've noted how that Solomon has transitioned from much of what he was discussing in the first half of chapter 8 regarding being proper, not just citizens in the country in which we dwell, but also being good servants of the government that exists, or the king in the case of chapter 8. And then he's transitioned from that into describing the ultimate, really he's kind of building up to the recognition of the ultimate purpose of man. That's really what this is boiling down to. And what he has described, especially here so far at the beginning of chapter 9, he's described that, as he says here in verse 1, I thought about all of this so that I could explain it, so that I could give this information and this wisdom to know that God is, yes, he's aware of everything that the righteous do, but the righteous have committed themselves and their works to God. Not that God isn't aware of the wicked or what they do, but as he says, the wise and their works are in the hand of God. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. Everything we know because God has taught it. Okay, going all the way back to Adam and Eve. Okay, even the Gentiles, after God gave them up, okay, in Romans chapter 1, Paul describes, they still understood or still had an understanding for those, at least that first generation, of what God had taught them. But then gradually they stopped serving the Creator to serve the creature as an excuse really to do what they wanted to do, because they didn't want to listen to God. But the idea of love and hatred, love coming from the righteous, the wisdom that is of God, and the hatred of man. You compare these two, they're really the contrast of these two, is what Solomon is describing. And then he describes, continuing not just to describe death, the fact that death happens to all, but that the righteous and the wicked both suffer the same. And it makes no difference whether how we've lived in this life, death will come. And that's the evil that he sees. It's not that God is unfair or that he's calling God evil, but under the sun, it seems unfair that this should be the case. To the good, the clean, the unclean, to him who sacrifices, to him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath as he who fears an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that, they go to the dead. But for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope. See, it all goes back to understanding not just the love of God, but also the teachings of God. Because this is ultimately what Solomon's going to conclude, fear God and keep his commandments. That requires an understanding of what God wants from us. But what he observes under the sun, this evil that he observes, is that both the righteous and the wicked both die. Death, it is not a respecter of persons. It doesn't consider a person's state before God. It doesn't consider their how old or young they are. It doesn't consider what gender or what race, ethnicity they are. It all boils down to all man die. That's just the way it is. Every man dies. And so when he describes this, truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Ultimately, what their purpose is on this earth while they're here, understanding the nature of man, that we all die, he contrasts the wicked with their full of evil, madness in their hearts while they live. Then after that they die. What was the purpose of it all? But the good thing that exists, and again, this is all under the sun, okay, from man's perspective, he says, but the good thing is, for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope. The idea that while I'm alive, I can still make changes. I can still turn away from madness. I can still turn away from evil to seek to serve God and understand what the love of God is and contrast it and not follow after the hatred of man. And that's what Solomon is describing as we get into verse 5. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. As we talked about last week, he's not describing the state of the soul from God's perspective or the soul's perspective for that matter. Again, this is under the sun. Okay, so as far as life on this earth is concerned, the dead know nothing. Okay, they're gone. And as far as our perspective on the dead, we don't still see them anymore. They're gone. But it says they have no more reward. Not speaking to the eternal reward of those who are faithful, but with regard to physical profit. And not necessarily just in material terms, but reward, whether that be influence or authority or power, riches, whatever it may be. There is nothing else to gain because the soul obviously can't take it with them. The memory of them is forgotten. And he speaks to maybe one certain appeal, I guess you could say, of the reward that man really kind of seeks. And we talked a little bit about this last week, in that it seems like the more powerful, especially absolute power, we think about kings and pharaohs of the past and how that these incredible undertaken projects, the pyramids and towers and so forth, these wondrous things that have been created at the hands of those servants of these pharaohs and kings, these individuals, they sought to leave a legacy. They sought to be remembered. And yet even now, even our archaeologists aren't sure which pharaohs built which pyramids, not completely. And so ultimately the reward, and again, there's material reward that won't come to the soul because the soul is passed from this life. But in reference to specifically as he says there at the end of verse 5, the memory of them is forgotten, ultimately what a man leaves behind, his legacy, is generally as important, if not more important, than riches or anything else that he may have during his life. And in fact, in a lot of ways, when we look through history, a person's legacy, what they've left, or what they're, especially if they were aware of it or particularly obsessed with leaving a legacy behind, it's like they went out of their way to be remembered. And in a lot of cases, especially going past 200 or 300 years from our current history, most of that's been forgotten. Okay? And in 200 or 300 years, who knows whether the history of our last 300 years will be remembered. Okay? It's a constant cycle. And the knowledge that nothing lasts should put into perspective for those who are still living, verse 5, those who are still living, that there is only one purpose for man. That ultimately striving for anything lasting on this earth under the sun is pointless. It's vain. That's why he says, verse 6, also their love, their hatred, their envy have now perished. Nevermore will they share in anything done under the sun. Everything that they were, their personality, their cares, what they knew, what they learned. I mean, in a lot of ways, Solomon is describing, in some ways, the vanity of the pursuit of earthly wisdom, and to a certain extent. In that, as he looked at it, remember back in chapter 8, his ultimate conclusion was there is no way to look into the things that are specifically God's realm. There's no way to know what's going to happen in the future. There are certain aspects of wisdom we cannot understand because they belong to God. And so in some ways, Solomon, I would imagine it was a humbling experience for him. In all of his wisdom, even he couldn't figure it all out, which is ultimately why he comes to this conclusion. Take stock of where you are and what your priorities and perspective is under the sun. Realize what our ultimate end is, and then plan accordingly in your life to make your choices, make actions accordingly, not to leave a legacy behind on this earth as if this is all that matters, but rather to leave a legacy behind that speaks to your serving God, fearing God and keeping His commandments. Debbie?
One of the things that this brings to my mind is that ultimately the only one we matter to, truly matter to, is God.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I as my parents did. So ultimately what matters is that we matter to God, not that
Right.
we matter to anybody here, because a generation or two goes by and we don't matter to anybody,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Well, and in a lot of ways, if the characteristics of my ancestors were of people who were faithful to God, then I can have those same characteristics, not because I'm just seeking to be like my ancestors, because I seek to be what God wants me to be. So in many ways, you share, that's kind of like why the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 12, seeing that we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, this is the type of company we keep with Abraham, with Noah, with Sarah, with David, all of these individuals of faith who, since the beginning of time, their characteristics of faith, even though the laws have changed, their character of faith has always stayed the same. God's requirement of the character of faith has never changed. Belief and obedience has always been a part of the characteristics of God's people. And that is why this continues to be characteristics that we see consistently, like in the chapter of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. And so, yeah, in a lot of ways, despite the fact that I may not remember my great-great-grandparents, my great-greats, I don't remember them, but that if they were, and they were, at least one set, were faithful Christians, then in some ways there's a connection there to them because of their faith, because I seek to follow after faith. The idea of legacy, that's why I say the legacy we leave behind should speak to our desire to serve God. Okay? Never mind how powerful we were, how rich we were, how many people followed us, or anything else. That's not important. What's important is whether or not we feared God and kept His commandments. Anything else through verse 6? In a lot of ways, man, and I know it seems like this is more so true today than it's ever been. I don't really think that's the case. It seems more true because we have news by the second, okay? But in a lot of ways, man is ruled by his emotions. And those emotions, generally, unless they're trained to react properly, those emotions lead man down a bad path, down the path of evil. And that's part of what verse 6, their love, their hatred, their envy have now perished. Ultimately, everything that consumed them, everything that was their focus, and the things that they felt were important, the treasure that was in their heart, it's all gone now. Nothing's left of it. And it doesn't matter anymore because they've gone. And especially in verse 6, his context is men who have died not faithful to God is really what the concept is. But it's true regardless, no matter if they are or not. But his point is, never more will they have a share in anything done under the sun. Which all goes back to the emphasizing of make the most of the time you have now. Use it to fear God and keep His commandments. Because once you've passed from this life, you can't change it. There's no going back after that. Okay, whatever state you die in, that's the state you're judged in. And that is part of what Solomon is describing here, in that you need to make the most of this time. While you're living, you have hope. Anything through verse 6. Verse 7. So, and he has come to this conclusion on numerous occasions, stemming from different branches of wisdom and thought that he's gone through over the last 8 chapters. But notice verse 7, he says, "Go, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, let your head lack no oil." In particular, verse 7 is widely misunderstood and misapplied in a lot of ways. Verse 7, okay, this is the same thing Solomon's been saying all along, is that in the end, what does man have to enjoy in this, under the sun? What does man have to enjoy? What has Solomon concluded over the last 8 chapters that man has to enjoy? Under the sun. The fruit of his labor, right? Which is eating and drinking what you have, and being content. And that's kind of one word that he doesn't use, but it's written in between the lines every time he comes to this conclusion: eat and drink and be merry. Okay, you don't include that for tomorrow we die. Paul uses that in 1 Corinthians 15. That's not the context of what Solomon says. Paul uses that. He kind of uses that to make a point. The concept is that in this world, all we have to enjoy ultimately are what we need to live. We have our bread, we have our drink to sustain us, and ultimately this is what we need to survive. And those opportunities in which we may have an abundance or have certain luxuries, all the more, okay, all the better. But in the end, the concept of contentment is not to pursue the things or to be obsessed with the things you don't have, but rather be thankful for the things you do have. Okay? And that's really kind of a lot of what Solomon concludes with regard to man's enjoyment under the sun. There is nothing that suggests that we can go beyond what God has told us regarding the conduct of a Christian. Okay? There's nothing there that suggests that, well, God just wants you to enjoy your life and to live how you want to and He'll accept you. That's not what he's saying. And that's what comes to at the end of verse 7. There are times where this verse is used to make it say, God has already accepted your works. As long as you believe on Him, you can do whatever you want to. God has already accepted your works because it's coming from somebody who is a believer. And it's kind of in combination to defend a faith only and once saved, always saved concept. The idea that all I have to do is believe, and once I believe, I'm saved, and once I'm saved, it doesn't matter, I can't lose it. God has already accepted your works. That being the case, that's how people sometimes use this passage. What do you think Solomon's actually saying? Is Solomon talking about the context of salvation? Is that what he's dealing with? Salvation from the perspective of righteous and unrighteous works to God? So how does life under the sun fit into the context of verse 7 and 8? God has already accepted your works. How does that fit? Well, if God's already accepted my works under the sun, and it doesn't matter what I do, then I can be saved and I can just do whatever I want. Is that what?
That's the past works, it's not the future works.
Okay.
Lose it.
Huh?
We can lose it.
Okay. There is a recognition of the focus and the mindset of the individual who's serving God. And this is to whom Solomon's addressed. This is really ultimately, when he says, go, eat your bread with joy, he's speaking directly to people who are seeking to serve God, okay, people of faith. So he reminds them as to what reward we have under the sun, to be content, to enjoy the pleasures of this life within the commandments of God, for God has already accepted your works, which is to say, if he's speaking to faithful people, and faithful people fear God and do what? Keep His commandments. You're serving God, and your mindset has been to serve Him and to be content with the blessings that you're given. Okay? God has the idea of already accepting your works. Those things that you have done, God has taken. He's accepted those. You go forward and keep and maintain is really the idea of maintaining that status of being content in your life, of focusing on God, of fearing Him and keeping His commandments. That's why he says, go, verse 7. Not, God has already accepted your works no matter what you may do in the future, as Jack said. What you have done, God has accepted, yes, from a spiritual standpoint, but there's also that sense in which, from a physical standpoint, because the things that you've done because you've had the proper perspective. Okay? The works of man's hands, I know ultimately they're not going to last. So my purpose in doing them is really ultimately to serve God no, Google, go away. I didn't talk to you. Is to serve God and to do what He wants me to do. That's what my purpose is. God has accepted my works on that basis, and not just sacrifices of the law and so forth, things of the law, but of life in general, because that is the filter from which all of my conduct comes. It's through the filter of fearing God and keeping His commandments. And so no matter what my hand finds to do, if it's within the law of God, within the commandments of God, within the character He demands of His people, God has accepted those works because the motivation of them, the purpose of them is with the right perspective. Okay? It's not just about sin and not sin, or works of, doing works of law the way we should, okay, following the law, keeping His commandments, or not. Even more broadly than that, it's having the proper perspective on life. That's the context so far through chapter 9, is having the right perspective and realizing that man without God, what is his purpose? What purpose does he have in what he does? To please himself. Hatred, and we talked about madness and evil, because man's purpose, the filter from which everything he does, is to serve himself, as opposed to seeking to serve God. Thus, verse 7, go eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart. Enjoy those things for which you've worked, knowing, having the right perspective, knowing that none of this is going to last. God has already accepted your works because they have come from one who seeks to serve Him, knowing that this world, in the end, it's going to pass and nothing's going to be left. And when I die, I'm gone. And so I need to make the most of the time that I have, be content with what I have, and fear God and keep His commandments. Any thoughts so far through verse 7? Yes, sir.
There's a contrast between the previous verses, like you're pointing
Oh,
out.
absolutely.
These individuals are dead and gone. There's no more work under the sun for them that God is going to judge them upon because their works are done.
Yep.
King James, at the end of verse 7, says God now accepts your works. It includes what you've already done, but the
Yep.
point is, you're alive now.
Yep.
This is the time period when God's going to review your life. When you're alive.
Mm-hmm.
It goes without saying, but contrasted with those who are dead, it's over.
Right.
There's nothing else under the sun, into verse 6, that they can do.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
you have your time now, so here's what you do.
Right. Absolutely. And that leads to verse 8. Let your garments always be white. Yes, it's a metaphorical or figurative. It's not really a literal concept of let your garments be white, and verse 8, let your head lack no oil. It's more from the sense of perspective. And again, this goes to what Joe was talking about, and it recognizes your thought process has been to serve God. Okay? That verse 8 continues that thought process. Let your garments always be white. And I find it so fascinating that sometimes people will use verse 7 to say, see, once saved, always saved. But then what does Solomon say in verse 8? What is possible that I could let happen?
It won't be possible.
It's possible I might let my garments get dirty. Okay? Again, it's that cherry picking, slotting that one verse out and making it say what you want it to say. Verse 8 says, let your garments always be white. He's speaking to people who are seeking to serve God. He's speaking to that sense of perspective in which all of my works I do for God, recognizing what my state is on this earth. I'm alive now. And continue in it, verse 8. Let your garments always be. That's the responsibility on me to maintaining white garments. Let your head lack no oil. Oil, especially the anointing of one's head with oil, that is an aspect all the way going back from the Old Law into the New Testament we see on several occasions. There's several different reasons and purposes for which it was used, but one purpose for that was a sense of honor, a setting apart, and in some ways, in some aspects of it, almost a sanctification to a certain extent. And that's part of what Solomon's bringing up here. Let your head lack no oil. You always maintain the honor of serving God. Maintain the wisdom of recognizing who and what you are, what your purpose here is. And recognize that in the end, what you do for God, not for yourself. Thoughts through verse 8. Yes, sir.
In Revelation 7, that same idea is carried over to the New Testament, the saints who have white robes.
Yes.
And it seems like in this day and age, we downplay, by and large, our society downplays the idea of being holy.
Yeah.
God expects and demands holiness, and that hasn't changed from the Old Testament to the New Testament.
Right.
He demands that of His people. But we seem to have this concept that we can go and do what we want. God's grace will cover, and it's all good. It will cover, but we've got to repent and change and get back to doing what's right.
Right, right, absolutely. And in fact, I forget which church was it of the churches of Asia. Was it chapter 3? I don't think it was Laodicea. Maybe it was Laodicea that Jesus referenced buying white. Yeah, it was, because he referenced their nakedness and how that they should buy from him eye salve and white robes and so forth, white garments. And that representation of that holiness, that purity that is to be maintained. And of course, attached to that purity and holiness is the motivations for which I do what I do. You know, the mindset, the attitude with which I approach life. If I approach life that it's all about me and all for me, then I'm not going to live the way God wants me to live. And while I'm alive, I still have the opportunity to realize that and change. Anything else through verse 8? All right, verse 9. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which he has given you under the sun, all your days of vanity. For that is your portion in life, and in the labor which you perform under the sun. Verse 10. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you're going. So the transition from verse 8 to verse 9 and 10 recognizes practical application of the fact that you have the time that you have and that's it. So make the most of it. Use it wisely, use it in holiness, use it to serve God. So part of this wisdom, part of this advice that Solomon gives, verse 9, live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life. He uses this phrase several times. And every time you read it, you think, vain life, my life doesn't matter. Okay? What's the phrase that he adds to this? Under the sun. Okay, we keep coming back to that phrase. Because under the sun, does life of itself mean anything? Does life with the purpose of serving God mean something? Yes, it does. Okay? But the reference to your vain life is that in the end, life is here for a while and then it's gone. Okay? It's not that our life doesn't matter. It's that life is short. So live joyfully. And there's a reference to those who have spouses with the wife whom you love all the days of your life. The idea, of course, the adjective being described, how should I live? With what attitude or what thought process should I have? Joyfully. Joyfully. Okay, and we've talked about the difference between happiness and joy. Okay, happiness is an emotion that comes and goes. Joy is a state of mind. It is a recognition that I am blessed. And of course, contentment is attached to joy in that the only way I can be content is to recognize what God has given me and not be obsessed with what He hasn't given me or what I don't have. And so the idea of living joyfully, there is a sense of contentedness that is attached to this as well, which He has given you under the sun. And again, just as James describes those who say, let's go to such and such a city, we'll buy and sell there. But what should they say? If the Lord wills, we will. Before he gets to that part. If the Lord wills, we will live and go do this and that. Okay, if the Lord wills, I'll still be alive in order to do this and that. And of course, the recognition that life comes from God, that every new day is a blessing. That's part of what Solomon is applying here as well, verse 9, when he says, your vain life which he has given you under the sun, all your days of vanity. Not that your life doesn't matter, but that in the broad scheme of under the sun, it comes and it goes. For that is your portion and life and the labor, and in the labor which you perform under the sun. Not to say that those who don't have a spouse can't live joyfully, or that they don't have a portion in life. But his point certainly goes to the contented nature of living that life. Okay? And especially when you consider different aspects of the argumentations over what the Jews brought to Jesus, can I divorce my spouse for any reason? Finding reasons to get rid of my spouse in order to get someone else. This is part of what, in a lot of ways, this idea of being content in the state that you're in this case, being married, you be content with that spouse. And you notice he says in at the end of verse 9, that is your portion in life. What you have to enjoy within the commandments of God, that is your portion in life. That is the broad application that Solomon's applying here. Your portion in life is to enjoy what God has given you to bless you. Okay? Those of you who have a spouse, live joyfully. This is a blessing from God. But going all the way back up to verse 7, okay? Eat and drink. This is a blessing from God. Live joyfully. Be content. In the labor which you perform under the sun, he says in verse 9. Verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. Which is to say, this could be taken a little bit too far to an extreme, but one of the things my grandfather always taught me, especially when I was growing up, and he'd make me sweep the garage. I hated sweeping the garage. Just dust everywhere and everything. And I would kind of just be lackadaisical with it. In fact, there was one morning he took me to one of his warehouses to paint the wall, and I was just kind of, it's like 6 o'clock in the morning. And he walked off. He said, let's just go. He's like, if you're going to do something, you do it. You don't just stand there and kind of half do it, you do it. And his point was, listen, when you commit yourself to do something, you do it with all of your energy. You accomplish the task that is set before you, and you accomplish it maybe not happy. I mean, should I be happy to paint the wall? No, nobody's happy necessarily to paint a wall, and if you are, I apologize, but that's just weird. But can I be joyful in the fact that I am able to do this, I have the health to do this, and that it is a blessing from God what I may gain from doing this, the fruit of my labor? Okay, this is why Solomon, whatever your hands find to do, do it with your might. Again, within the commandments of God, within what He has told us, but whatever, you put your energy, you commit yourself to it. Because not only will that serve you, but in a lot of ways, and of course Solomon doesn't really deal with this particular application, but do even people in the world respect those who work hard? You may not love your job, but if you have your job and you work hard at it, do people notice that? Your focus and your determination, and you do it well, you do it efficiently. Okay, this is a part of that enjoying the fruit of your labor, because people tend to notice that. They tend to praise those types of attitudes and characteristics, and we certainly know, in no matter what year, no matter what decade it is, in any given workforce, you want hard workers, not just people who are going to show up and then just sit there. You want people who are willing to work. Yes, ma'am.
Well, our parents always raised us, remember you're representing the family. And as Christians, we're representing God in everything that we do. So even if it's picking up trash along the highway, I'm in a situation where I thank God for the work He gives me every day, especially when there's income attached to it, just because of the situation I've chosen for myself. But I'm very blessed in that situation, but to thank God that we can have busy hands and we can represent Him if we're out doing something with the world. I really think that's what, back to the part about being married. I've been single my whole life, and a friend of mine just wrote a thing about treasuring your wife and stuff like that. And marriage can be a blessing. It can also be absolutely horrible. And for Christians, it's supposed to be a blessing, and you should live for Christ in that marriage and in everything that we do. So it is a blessing. Being single is a blessing to me. I don't have all the toils of a marriage. I have different ones, but so everything we do is, as my parents taught me, you're representing the Nichols family or the Lambert family, whatever it is. You make sure that you're doing it right. For us, we put on the name of Christ, and now we're representing Christ.
Right.
So we have to be sure that our example and our attitude is such that we have a good reflection on Him.
Right.
Are a good reflection.
Well, and certainly not to serve the unjust misrepresentations of people when they think of Christians as being lazy, or they think of Christians as being, hypocrites or something along that nature, especially with regard to whatever our hand finds to do it with all of our might, to put our effort into it. And in a lot of ways, there are those who are not blessed with the ability to even work. For some physical reason or some other reason that they deal with, they're not even able to work. And so just to recognize the blessedness of having, and we might be limited by age or by some physical aspect, but if we are able to work or able to do something to help support ourselves or our family or whatever, that is a blessing. And rather than feeling jealous or envious of others who are able to do whatever they want, or feeling somehow as if we've been shortchanged because I'm not able to do these other things that I'd rather do, be content with what I can, because it could be worse. Okay? And certainly, that's broader than perhaps what Solomon certainly is talking about, but all those applications certainly exist. Anything so far through the first part of verse 10 through 9 and 10? All right. Second part of verse 10. For there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. In other words, enjoy it while you can. Okay? It's of course, for those of us who, I know for my grandfather, once he retired and he got up in age, he was like, I'll be happy when this is all said and done. I want to, he believed he was going to sleep. I said, you can sleep, I'll rest, it's fine. But he said, when I die, I'm sleeping. He said, I've been working all my life, I'm going to sleep. Okay, all right, you sleep. And you take a break. But of course, the other side of that coin is, while you have the time, use it. Use it for good. Use it to, as Lisa pointed out, to set forth the right example of what a Christian is supposed to be, of working hard in whatever it is you find to do, of living joyfully, of being content, because you will not have this chance once it's gone. Once it's gone, there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you're going. And he's not speaking from the perspective of the souls or of God, from the living. Anything else through verse 10? All right, verse 11. So verse 11 is kind of similar to some of these other chapters. He kind of goes through, and again, chapter headings weren't put in by Solomon. They were put in by man as a convenience. So in a lot of ways, sometimes you'll see times where it seems like his thought is continuing between chapter headings, and other times where in the middle of a chapter his thought may turn or kind of switch gears a little bit. Verse 11 is one of those times. Okay, verse 11, in fact, verse 11 out of all of Ecclesiastes, and there's so much to choose from, but Ecclesiastes to me is or here from verse 11 following, it's a wonderful way of pointing out the fact that you can't count on anything in this life. And that's really what this is building off of, because verse 10, you don't know how long you have, you don't know what's going to happen the rest of your life, use the time you have, live joyfully. Verse 11, so I returned and saw under the sun that. And here's some things he observed. And of course, all these observations lead to the same point. But his observations were, for instance, the race is not to the swift. Will the quickest always win? Not always. Will they sometimes win or often win even? Maybe. But will there be times when perhaps even the slowest person out there, for some other reason than speed, wins the race? What's the lesson we teach our kids with the hare and the tortoise? Okay, the turtle, the hare and the tortoise. Okay, that's part of what Solomon's point is that the race is not to the swift. Conventional wisdom says the quickest will win. That's not necessarily always going to happen. Nor is the battle to the strong. You would think that the strongest, the mightiest, they will always win the fights. But is that always true? And in fact, even in history, I would even suggest that may not even necessarily happen most of the time. Okay? Because, what is it that Sun Tzu says? Something along the lines of the strong fight and use their energy, but the wise general, something along the lines of how wisdom and using tactics can change the outcome of a battle. If you're fighting a battle where they're stronger than you are, then tactics can serve to counteract that. And in a lot of ways, throughout history, it seems like people who may have had the stronger army, sometimes they tend to lose because they weren't very smart with them. Yes, ma'am.
Well, if you put that into the athletic realm, sometimes you have a team that's bigger and stronger and faster, but at the end of the game, they'll say, well, they were just outcoached.
They were outcoached. Outcoached and outworked.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that happens second week of September, because my guys play Alabama, and that's not going to be fun. But you never know, because this is what Solomon's point is. The battle's not always to the strongest. They're not always going to be the ones who win. Sometimes it's the underdog. In fact, we have a habit of rooting for the underdog. Okay? And that's kind of that sense in which sometimes the underdog does win. Yes, ma'am.
I think of not the swift or the strong, but endurance as opposed to being the fastest.
Yes.
Can endure.
Yes.
Or not the strongest of the world who can endure.
Right, right. There's different characteristics that can counteract the ones that are the most obvious. And that's what Solomon's point is that while your human wisdom would suggest that this is the case, you're not taking into account all of the variables. And certainly from a man's perspective, again, this is under the sun, there's a level of chance, of luck, if you will, that kind of goes along with it. And football certainly is luck, in my analogy. Yes, ma'am.
And especially we want to endure till the end.
Yeah.
That's what our goal is.
Well, and what's one of the common rants that sometimes coaches have at the end of a game? We only played 3 quarters and it's a 4-quarter game. Or we only played good for 1.5 halves of the basketball game, and the last 10 minutes we just quit. That goes back to that endurance. Yes, ma'am.
Well, we're told that it's the one, we're not in a short race, we're in a long race, but, your question, will the fast win? Well, if they're in a sprint, the fastest is going to win. But we're running an ultra marathon, not even a marathon, but an ultra marathon. So if you look at what a 50-yard dash takes a couple of seconds by the fastest people in the world, right? But hours take place on an ultra marathon, sometimes 18 to 20 hours. And you think about the psychological stuff that happens in 5 seconds and the psychological stuff that happens in 15 hours. We're in the 15-hour race or the 20-hour race. So a lot of our race is mental.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, we're going to have physical things that come along. Blisters, hurt ankles, headaches,
Right.
dehydration. But all of those are overcome by our mental mindset.
Yeah.
Our mental
Well,
ability to adjust to our situation.
right. And I really think the application can apply to the 50-yard dash too. I mean, you could be the quickest. You could be, I don't even know if Lightning, what's his name, Bolt, Hussein, or whatever his name is. Hussein Bolt, thanks. I don't know if he's still racing or not. But as quick as he may be, okay, if he's not focused and he trips over his own feet from the get-go, is he going to win? Okay, I mean, the analogies are consistent all the way through. He says, nor bread to the wise. Will the wise always be rich? No. The wise will not always be the richest. Nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill. All right, we'll stop there with verse 11. That's why verse 12, man also does not know his time. And that's what he's going to get to regarding all of this. All right, thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments. We'll pick up in verse 11 next week.